The Palipuka Trail in Maui is not a place for the faint of heart. Known to locals and seasoned hikers as a knife-edge ridge, it is a narrow spine of volcanic rock where the wind whips across from the Pacific, and a single stumble can send a person plunging hundreds of feet into the jagged ravine below. On March 24, 2025, Ariel Koik stood on one of those precarious edges. It was her 36th birthday, a milestone usually celebrated with cake, family, and laughter. But as the Hawaiian mist rolled over the cliffs, dampening the red earth beneath her boots, Ariel felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. She was standing there with the man who had promised to protect her, her husband, Ghart. He was a high-stakes anesthesiologist, a man whose hands held the literal power of life, death, and consciousness every day in the operating room. But as he urged her closer to the cliff's edge for one more selfie, Ariel realized with a heart-stopping jolt that the man standing behind her wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at her as a problem that needed to be solved, and he had brought his hospital medical bag to ensure she never left that mountain. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. To anyone looking at their social media or walking past their home, Ghart and Ariel Koik were the embodiment of the Hawaiian dream. They resided in a $1.5 million estate tucked away in a private, gated community within the West Maui Mountains. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of luxury, a symbol of the success Ghart had achieved as a respected medical professional at Maui Memorial Medical Center. In the sterile, high-pressure environment of the hospital, Ghart was the man in charge of the vitals. He knew exactly how much of a chemical was needed to put a body to sleep, and exactly how much would make it stop breathing forever. Ariel was his intellectual match. A nuclear engineer by training, she possessed a mind built for logic, precision, and complex problem-solving. Though she had transitioned into being a stay-at-home mother to raise their two young sons, she was far from the passive figure the defense would later try to portray. She was a woman of science, a woman who understood cause and effect. And she had begun to notice that the cause of the tension in her home was her husband's spiraling paranoia. Beneath the manicured lawns of their gated community, the Koik marriage was disintegrating. Court filings and later police interviews would paint a grim picture of the months leading up to the hike. Ghart had become consumed by a toxic, unfounded suspicion that Ariel was being unfaithful. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was an obsession that allegedly manifested in sexual abuse and physical intimidation. The situation had grown so dire that Ariel had previously filed for a temporary restraining order, TRO. She told authorities that she was living in fear, and the couple had started intensive counseling to address Ghart's accusations of infidelity. For Ariel, the getaway to Oahu for her birthday was a desperate hope, a chance to hit the reset button, to find the man she had fallen in love with before the shadows took over. They left their two sons in the safety of their Maui home with a nanny, a detail that would later prove to be the only reason Ariel found the strength to fight back. The morning of March 24th started with an invitation that, in hindsight, was a setup. Ghart suggested they hike the Palipuka Trail. He knew the area was officially closed to the public, a fact signaled by prominent area closed signs at the trailhead. In a court of law, walking past those signs is a trespass. On that morning, it was the first step in a premeditated plan to ensure there would be no witnesses. As they ascended the trail, the terrain became increasingly hostile. The path narrowed until there was only room for one person at a time, with sheer drops on either side. Ariel, despite her intelligence and bravery, felt a primitive sense of dread. She was nervous about the heights, the wind, and the isolation. But Ghart was persistent. He kept asking her to pose for selfies. He wanted her at the very edge with the abyss at her back. The transition from husband to attacker happened in a heartbeat. As Ariel walked past Ghart to position herself for another photo, the man she shared a bed with reached out. He didn't grab her hand to steady her. He gripped her shoulders with a terrifying, calculated strength. He began to shove her toward the crumbling lip of the cliff. The silence of the mountain was shattered by his voice. No longer the calm, clinical tone of a doctor, but a snarl of pure, unfiltered rage. "I'm sick of this bleep," he allegedly screamed. "You're a lying bleep." In that split second, the reality of her situation crystallized. The infidelity accusations, The closed trail, the selfies, it was all leading to this. Ariel Koik realized that her husband was trying to erase her from the earth. But as her heels hovered over the empty air, she didn't scream for herself. She thought of her sons. She realized that if she went over that edge, they would be left with a murderer for a father. Ariel didn't just fall. She fought. With the instinct of a mother, she threw her entire body weight forward, slamming herself onto the dirt and rock of the trail. She anchored herself to the ground, grabbing at the earth as Ghart tried to heave her upward to toss her over. They began to wrestle in the dirt, a life and death struggle on a ridge so narrow that any sudden movement could have sent them both over. Ghart managed to pin her down, using his weight to crush the breath out of her. But it was what he did next that turned a domestic assault into something much more calculated. With one hand holding Ariel down, he reached into his black, one-shoulder Patagonia bag, the bag Ariel recognized as the one he took to the hospital every single day. From the bag, he didn't pull out a phone or a water bottle. He pulled out a clear glass vial and a medical syringe. Ariel stared at the needle in horror. She knew her husband's profession. She knew that inside that bag were the tools he used to navigate the veil between life and death. He wasn't just trying to kill her with gravity. He was prepared to sedate her into a permanent sleep. The sight of the syringe was a revelation. This wasn't an eruption of anger. This was a clinical execution. He had brought his work to the mountain to finish her. As the needle moved toward her skin, Ariel managed to summon a final burst of strength, knocking the syringe from Ghart's hand. It spun through the air and disappeared into the thick Hawaiian brush. For a second, there was a pause, a breath of hope. But as Ghart's face contorted with a new level of fury, he didn't look for the needle. He reached back into the bag, and as his hand wrapped around a second, even more terrifying object, Ariel realized that her husband hadn't just come with a plan B. He had come to make sure she never left that trail alive, no matter how many weapons it took. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. As the first syringe skittered across the volcanic rock and vanished into the dense ferns of the Palapuka Trail, a heavy, suffocating silence fell between the two. Ariel Koik lay pinned beneath her husband, the man she had loved for years, now a stranger with a predator's eyes. She could feel the damp earth against her back and the heat of his breath on her face. In that moment, her engineer's brain, usually tuned to equations and structural integrity, shifted into a different kind of survival mode. Psychological warfare. She knew she couldn't overpower him physically. Ghart was an athletic man, fueled by a terrifying surge of adrenaline and a dark, singular purpose. So, she did the only thing she could. She stopped fighting his muscles and started fighting his conscience. With her back against the literal edge of existence, Ariel began to speak. She didn't scream for the police. She screamed the names of their children. She shouted the names of his parents. She invoked every ghost of their shared life, trying to pull the man she knew back to the surface. "Think about our boys, Ghart," she pleaded. "They only have us. Don't do this to them." For a flickering, deceptive second, it seemed to work. Ghart's hands, which had been reaching into his bag for a replacement syringe, went still. His expression softened from a mask of rage into something resembling confusion. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a heartbeat, the good doctor was back. He loosened his grip. He seemed to exhale. But as Ariel felt a tiny spark of hope, she realized the calm was actually a reset. The doctor was merely assessing the failure of his first method and preparing a second. The transition back into violence was faster and more brutal than the first. The moment Ariel mentioned the children again, Ghart's face hardened. He didn't reach back into the bag for another needle. Instead, his eyes landed on a piece of the mountain itself, a softball-sized piece of lava rock. It was jagged, heavy, and porous, a weapon fashioned by nature, now gripped by a man with a healer's knowledge of where to strike. This was no longer a clinical execution. It was a savage bludgeoning. Ghart grabbed Ariel by her hair, yanking her head upward with a force that made her neck snap back. He wanted her face exposed. He wanted her skull accessible. One blow landed on her forehead. Another caught her across the cheek. A third smashed into her hand as she tried to pull her hair from his grasp. The sound of the rock meeting bone was a dull, sickening thud that echoed in the silence of the closed trail. Ariel felt the warm, metallic rush of blood flowing into her eyes, blurring her vision into a red haze. Ghart wasn't just hitting her. He was trying to shatter her. He slammed her head repeatedly into the hard-packed dirt of the trail, using his other hand to pull her hair as a lever. In that moment of pure terror, Ariel realized the grim irony. Her husband, the man who spent his life ensuring patients didn't feel pain during surgery, was now inflicting the most primal, agonizing pain imaginable upon her. Ariel was fading. The world was beginning to tilt and go dark as the 10th blow from the lava rock landed. But through the ringing in her ears, she heard something impossible. A sound that shouldn't exist on a trail marked with area closed signs. Two female hikers, having decided to brave the closed trail for a morning view, rounded a bend in the ridge. The sight that met them was something out of a nightmare. A blood-soaked woman pinned to the earth by a man who looked like he belonged in a hospital, not a crime scene. Ariel saw the figures through her blood-slicked lashes. With a final, desperate surge of lung capacity, she shrieked, "He is trying to kill me! Help me! He's trying to kill me!" The sudden presence of witnesses acted like a bucket of ice water on Ghart's mania. The selfie story wouldn't work now. There were no accidents that involved a husband beating his wife with a rock. Realizing his plan had collapsed in front of an audience, Ghart didn't stay to render aid. He didn't try to explain himself. He stood up, dropped the bloodied rock, and bolted. He didn't run toward the trailhead where he might be intercepted. Instead, he plunged into the vertical, unforgiving jungle of the West Maui Forest Reserve, disappearing into the emerald shadows. The hikers acted with incredible speed. While one stayed with Ariel, trying to stem the heavy bleeding from her scalp, the other dialed 911. Within minutes, the peaceful stillness of the mountain was replaced by the thrum of rotors and the wail of sirens. Ariel was airlifted from the ridge. Her injuries were extensive. Multiple deep lacerations to her head that would require intricate surgery, a fractured hand, and facial bruising that would take weeks to fade. But as she was prepped for the operating table, the police were turning their attention to the forest. A massive manhunt was underway. The Maui Police Department, MPD, flooded the area with K-9 units, tactical teams, and thermal imaging from the air. They knew Ghart was an educated man, a doctor with potentially more tools on his person. They treated the forest as an active threat zone. For 6 long hours, while Ariel was under the knife of her husband's colleagues at the medical center, Ghart remained a ghost. While the police combed the brush, Ghart made a critical mistake, or perhaps a final act of narcissism. He turned his phone back on. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call the police to report a misunderstanding. He called his adult son, Emil. During this call, which the prosecution would later describe as a confession of intent, Ghart allegedly laid out his motive. He told his son that he had tried to kill Ariel because she was cheating on him. He spoke with a cold, detached certainty. He warned Emil that he was going to turn his phone off again so the pigs couldn't track his GPS coordinates. He wasn't a man in a state of shock. He was a man in a state of evasion. But the GPS pings had already done their work. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, a bedraggled, silent Dr. Ghart Koik emerged from the dense undergrowth and walked into the waiting arms of the law. He was handcuffed and taken into custody, charged with second-degree attempted murder. It seemed the story was over, a tragic eruption of domestic violence in paradise. But when Ariel finally returned to their $1.5 million home to collect her things, she opened a closet and found a hidden Nike fanny pack. And what she found inside suggested that the attack on the cliff wasn't just a moment of madness. It was the final stage of a much larger, much darker medical experiment. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Ariel Koik returned to the $1.5 million Maui estate not as a mistress of the house, but as a survivor visiting a crime scene. The gated community, with its manicured tropical flora and sweeping mountain views, felt like a hollow stage set. The physical trauma of the attack was still written across her body, thick bandages wrapped around her head to protect the surgical staples, her face swollen and bruised, her hands stiff from the defensive struggle. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the psychological weight of standing in the space she once shared with a man who had tried to bludgeon her into the earth. Despite her injuries, Ariel's mind, the mind of a nuclear engineer, was working with clinical precision. She knew that the man she had lived with was a creature of habit, a man of organized systems and professional secrets. While the police had processed the trail on Oahu, Ariel felt a nagging suspicion that the mountain wasn't the only place Ghart had hidden his intentions. She began to look through the domestic spaces they had shared, moving through the master bedroom with a sense of dread that grew with every drawer she opened. In the back of Ghart's closet, tucked away behind his professional attire and designer shoes, Ariel found a small, inconspicuous Nike fanny pack. To any outsider, it might look like a simple accessory for a morning jog. But Ariel recognized it instantly. This was Ghart's medical bag. As an anesthesiologist, he was often seen with this bag, moving to and from his shifts at Maui Memorial Medical Center. It was his mobile toolkit, a piece of his professional identity. When she unzipped the pack, the contents didn't just alarm her, they terrified her. Inside were several clear, plastic syringes and a collection of small glass vials, the kind found in hospital medication carts. There were no labels indicating a standard prescription for personal use. These were hospital-grade anesthesia medications. Ariel knew that in the hands of an expert like her husband, these vials didn't represent medicine. They represented a choice to stop a heart, to paralyze a diaphragm, or to induce a sleep so deep that a person would never wake up to feel the cold air of a cliffside drop. Ariel didn't hesitate. She called the Maui Police Department, and the discovery of the fanny pack sent a shockwave through the investigation. Because the initial attack had occurred on Oahu, the Honolulu Police Department was brought in to assist. The bag was treated with the highest level of forensic caution, immediately shipped from the island of Maui to Oahu for detailed analysis. A Honolulu officer documented the contents: multiple syringes and various vials containing anesthesia medications. This discovery changed the entire complexion of the case. It moved the narrative from a domestic dispute that went too far to a case of cold-blooded premeditation. The prosecution began to formulate a theory that was as brilliant as it was ghoulish. They believed Ghart hadn't just lost his temper on the trail. They believed he had been stockpiling these drugs from his workplace, creating a kill kit that would allow him to commit a murder that looked like a tragic accident. In their theory, Ghart's original plan was to inject Ariel, rendering her unconscious or paralyzed, and then simply nudge her off the cliff. Without the signs of a struggle, a toxicology report might miss the subtle presence of certain short-acting anesthetics, and her death would be ruled a fall or a suicide. It was only because Ariel fought back, knocking that first syringe into the bushes, that Ghart was forced to abandon his clean medical execution for the messy, primitive violence of the lava rock. On the strength of Ariel's testimony, the bloodied rock, the medical bag, and the phone call to his son, a grand jury indicted Ghart Koik on the charge of attempted murder in the second degree. For a man of Ghart's stature, the fall was meteoric. He was traded his scrubs for a jail jumpsuit, held on a high bond while awaiting a trial that could put him away for life. Ariel wasted no time in severing the legal ties that bound them. She filed for divorce, a move that was both a practical necessity and a symbolic reclaiming of her life. While she initially pursued a temporary restraining order, TRO, her attorney eventually indicated that because Ghart was securely behind bars, they would focus their energy on the criminal prosecution. Ariel was no longer a wife. She was the state's star witness. However, any hope for a quick resolution was shattered when Ghart's high-powered defense team began their counterattack. They didn't just present a different version of the facts. They attacked the very foundation of the prosecution's legal standing. They filed two massive motions to dismiss the case, seeking to have the charges dropped before a jury ever sat in a box. The first motion was a direct hit on the intent required for an attempted murder charge. The defense turned to the medical records from the day of the attack, specifically the forms filled out by the two physicians who treated Ariel at the medical center. On these standard forms, there is a question that carries immense legal weight. Did the injury create a substantial risk of death? Next to that question, both doctors had checked the box marked no. The defense argued that under Hawaii law, to prove attempted murder, the state must show the defendant took a substantial step toward a killing with a specific intent to kill. They seized on the doctor's no as a weapon. Their argument was brazen. If the injuries Ariel sustained from the rock didn't actually put her life in danger, then how could the prosecution claim Ghart had an intent to kill? They accused the prosecution of misleading the grand jury by withholding these medical reports. They argued that the jury was shown photos of a bloody Ariel and told a story of a death struggle. But they weren't told that the actual medical professionals who treated her didn't consider her injuries life-threatening. To the defense, this wasn't attempted murder. It was, at worst, an assault that had been overcharged by a zealous prosecutor looking for a headline. But the defense was just getting started. Their most explosive argument didn't center on the rock or the syringes, but on the testimony of Ghart's own son, Emil. They were about to allege that the confession that had captivated the public was actually a result of police manipulation and a legal error known as triple hearsay. As the court date approached, the question wasn't just whether Ghart did it. It was whether the prosecution had broken the rules so badly that the good doctor might actually walk free on a technicality. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. As the trial of Dr. Ghart Koik drew closer, the defense team unveiled their most sophisticated weapon, an attack on the integrity of the confession. In the court of public opinion, the phone call Ghart made to his son, Emil, was the smoking gun. But in the court of law, the defense argued it was little more than a whisper in a wind tunnel. They filed a motion to dismiss based on the use of triple hearsay, a legal term for a chain of statements so long and distorted that the original truth is lost. Point 1. The defense pointed out a glaring procedural choice by the prosecution. During the grand jury hearing, Emil, the man who actually heard his father's voice, was never called to the stand. Instead, the prosecution called Detective Spacek. Spacek told the grand jury what another detective, Detective Pigo, had written in a report about what Emil had said regarding what Ghart had allegedly confessed. This, the defense argued, was a game of telephone played with a man's life at stake. The defense's outrage didn't stop at the content of the testimony. It focused on the absence of the witness. To use hearsay in such a high-stakes manner, the prosecution generally has to prove that the witness is unavailable. The state told the grand jury that Emil was unavailable because he was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and his return date to Hawaii was unknown. Ghart's lawyers scoffed at this explanation. In a modern judicial system, being in Pennsylvania does not make a witness unavailable. They argued that the prosecution could have flown him back, subpoenaed him, or utilized a high-definition video link for his testimony. By failing to do so, the defense alleged that the state had strategically kept Emil off the stand to prevent him from clarifying his assumptions and potentially weakening the case. They argued this was a violation of due process so severe that the only remedy was to throw the entire case out. While the defense attacked the grand jury process, the prosecution launched a counterstrike aimed at Ghart's behavior during the 6 hours he spent hiding in the Maui brush. They filed a motion regarding Ghart's pre-arrest silence. Under the Fifth Amendment, every citizen has the right to remain silent, and usually that silence cannot be used against them. However, the prosecution argued that there is a window of time before an arrest where silence speaks volumes. The state's argument was centered on credibility. They pointed out that between the moment the attack was interrupted and the moment Ghart was handcuffed 6 hours later, he had every opportunity to reach out to emergency services. If he were an innocent man whose wife had fallen, or if he had acted in self-defense, the prosecution argued a reasonable person would have sought help immediately. They wanted the judge's permission to cross-examine Ghart on this silence if he chose to testify. They wanted to ask him, "If you were innocent, why did you hide in the jungle for 8 hours while your wife was in surgery? Why didn't you call 911? Why did you turn off your phone to avoid GPS tracking?" The prosecution argued that his silence wasn't a protected right in that context, but rather probative evidence of a guilty mind. The defense, of course, viewed this as a dangerous overreach. They argued that holding a civilian, even a highly educated doctor, to a standard of perfect behavior during a traumatic event was unfair. They contended that Ghart, having never been a criminal suspect, likely had no idea what was relevant to an investigation or how his actions would be perceived. To use his shock-induced silence as a weapon of impeachment, they argued, was to punish a man for exercising a fundamental constitutional protection before he even knew he was being charged. The legal war then moved to the very definition of attempted second-degree murder. The defense argued that the indictment was fatally vague. They filed a motion for a bill of particulars, demanding that the state specify exactly which act constituted the substantial step toward murder. Was it the shove at the cliff's edge? The defense argued there was no evidence they were even close enough to the edge for a fall to be fatal. Was it the syringe? The defense pointed out the syringes were never tested for lethal substances and were standard medical equipment. Was it the rock? Again, they pointed back to the doctors who said the rock didn't create a substantial risk of death. By forcing the prosecution to pick one specific act, the defense hoped to divide and conquer the evidence. If the state picked the rock, the defense would use the medical reports to downgrade the charge to assault. If the state picked the syringe, the defense would argue a lack of forensic proof. It was a high-stakes game of legal go, where the defense was trying to pin the prosecution into a corner. As the hearings for these motions approached, the tension in the Hawaiian legal community was palpable. While legal experts noted that it is extraordinarily rare for an attempted murder case to be dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be brought back, the motions could still chip away at the prosecution's arsenal. If the judge granted the defense's motions, the state might be forced to re-impanel a grand jury and start from scratch, this time bringing Emil in to testify and providing a much more specific set of charges. This would buy the good doctor more time and potentially weaken the momentum of the case. For Ariel Koik, the stakes were even higher. Every motion, every hearing, and every legal technicality meant she had to remain in the orbit of the man who had allegedly tried to bash her head in with a lava rock. She had moved on with the divorce, but the criminal case was a tether to her trauma. Her bravery on the trail, fighting off a needle, de-escalating a man with her children's names, and surviving a bludgeoning, now had to survive the cold, clinical scrutiny of the law. The case of Dr. Ghart Koik is a haunting study in the duality of man. It asks how a healer, a man of science and community respect, could find himself in a kill-kit scenario on a closed mountain trail. Whether the defense succeeds in its triple hearsay arguments, or whether the prosecution successfully uses Ghart's pre-arrest silence to secure a conviction, the facts of that morning on the Palapuka Trail remain unchanged. Ariel Koik went up that mountain for a birthday selfie and came down a survivor. Ghart Koik went up as a doctor and came down a defendant. As the gavel prepares to fall, the world watches to see if the good doctor can use the technicalities of the law to escape the consequences of the bleep he allegedly did on the edge of the Pacific. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more fact-based true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.